Alright guys, today we're going to show you how to make this great little splining jig for the table saw. It'll help you reinforce any of your simple miter joints around the shop. A miter is a common joint to use, but it's just not the strongest on its own. So if you add these decorative splines, you get the added benefit of the interesting look, plus you reinforce the corner joint. Works great for boxes like this, or if you're going to do a picture frame. Stick around, we'll show you how to make the jig. Once you have the plywood bottom cut to size and the miters all taped together, it's just a matter of folding it in. It almost seems like a child's toy, the way that it folds in so nicely together, but it's a nice way to glue it up just by using tape to make sure the miters stay together as the glue dries. So the first part of this jig you'll need is a board that will slide in between the fence when it's in the high mode and the steel component of the fence. Okay, so you can use hardwood for this. We actually used a piece of full 1-inch thick MDF that was actually drum sanded down to fit this space. Make sure that it's not too tight. It does need to slip in easily and slide without much resistance. The next piece you'll need is a spacer. It needs to be the same thickness as this upper lip of the profile of the fence. And then this is a mock-up of the vertical component of the jig. And so what we'll do to test that spacer thickness is we'll actually clamp this sandwich together, and if we find that the whole assembly still slides easily with this now clamped in place, this will simulate the screws and glue that will hold the jig together in reality. So if we find that that slides easily and maintains a square orientation with the table saw, then we know we've got a good thickness for this spacer. So if we look at the main board of the jig, we need to add these carrier boards. And they're just scraps of hardwood that we've pre-drilled and recessed some holes so we can screw it to the jig. And we actually added some self-adhesive sandpaper and 100 grit. And that'll just help to hold the workpiece in position when we're making spline cuts. Let's go ahead and finish attaching these carrier boards. So not much to installing these boards, just 2-inch pocket hole style screws. And we'll fasten that to the jig. The ideal position of these carrier boards is such that as you install a workpiece into the jig, it should allow the corner, that mitered edge of your project, to come right down to the table saw. So keep that in mind when you're mounting these boards. Normally I might take something like this over to the bench to assemble it, but since we've got all the critical parts right here at the table saw, let's just go ahead and brad nail it together temporarily, and then we'll come back and reinforce things with some screws. So we'll switch to 1 1/4 inch long nails for this step. Again, it doesn't much matter because we're going to reinforce everything with screws in just a moment. And we'll tip that main jig assembly into place. Work the glue around a little bit, make sure we get a good bond. And I've got lines on my jig where I know exactly where to nail. And we'll secure that away. Looks like it's still sliding really well. So if we install the project box into the jig, we can see why it's so important to get the position of these carrier boards just right. Again, the goal is to support the mitered edge of your project with the cast iron top of the table saw. Install a combination blade on the table saw, one with at least some of the teeth being flat raker style teeth. That'll help make a flat bottom cut for these splines. Also, set the depth of cut so that you don't quite intersect the inside of the box. Where you place the splines in the box is somewhat subjective. My main goal here is to keep the slot away from the bottom panel of this keepsake box. So we've got the rip fence adjusted accordingly, and we'll go ahead and make those cuts. And then to spline the other side, assuming you want symmetrical layout to your spline cuts, just flip the box around and the setup remains unchanged. So we'll make a rip fence adjustment for another spline centered between the first pair and make that cut. Now this design works just as well for boxes as it does for picture frames. So if you have a picture frame that you want to cut a spline in, maybe centered, maybe offset, depending on the design. If you've got a picture frame with a beveled front edge, maybe it would be an offset spline towards the back edge for maximum strength. But either way, it works just as well with picture frames. We'll go ahead and do a demo cut there. So either way, boxes or picture frames, the splining jig is a great one to have around the shop. So we've got a little bandsaw crosscut sled made up, and we're going to use that to trim our spline stock to finished length. We need about 1 3/4 inch long pieces for the splines, so we'll go ahead and cut those up now. So no need to clamp the splines in place, they're just a good friction fit. Glue those heavily and set them in place, let them dry. We'll cut those off with a flush trim saw. Initially I was going to use a hand flush trim saw to trim off these splines, but I think we have another good excuse to use the crosscut sled for the bandsaw, so let's give that a try. Just a little sanding and we'll have those splines nice and smooth. Alright guys, that's the rundown on how to make that nice little splining jig that'll ride on the fence of your table saw. I hope something here has inspired you to get out in the shop this week. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the next one.